All right, so good morning, everybody, and welcome to our program, The New Student Mindset, How Gen Z and COVID-19 are Impacting Recruiting Practices. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Danielle, and I'm the Associate Director of Employer Engagement here at the Career Development Center at St. Joe's. And on behalf of our team, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to be with us today. And as always, thank you for your partnership and commitment to recruiting our students. So why did we decide to offer this session today? Mostly because we've been giving each other this look too many times to count over the last couple of years. But really, the idea for today's program came from questions that we've raised all year, not only from our staff, but from our campus partners, our employer partners, and people have been asking things like, why are students not showing up for in-person events? Why are students reneging on good offers? How do I get through to student orgs, and what would entice a student to show up for a virtual information session? If you ask a group of our students, they'll all give you different answers. We know, we've surveyed them, we've asked them after pretty much every event we've hosted this year. And our counseling team has even posed these questions to student orgs in their group workshops as well. We always get varying responses. So how do we as counselors and staff and you, recruiters and hiring managers, answer these questions? So the goal of today's program is to inform you about the current student mindset and behavior on our campus so that you can begin to think differently about the ways you might approach students when recruiting in the future. I want to point out that today we'll be speaking to data and observations we have made about the students on the St. Joe's campus specifically. We're in touch with other universities in the area, and we know that many of them have the same issues, but we'll specifically be speaking to the post-COVID Gen Z experience here at St. Joe's. So let's jump to the agenda. And I'm just going to quickly ask if you aren't muted, if you wouldn't mind muting. Thank you. So today we're going to begin by briefly reviewing the poll results we asked you to complete last week. I think you'll find that the responses we received affirm the way most of us have been feeling about student behavior this year. We'll then hear from Marci Berney, the director of the Office of Student Outreach and Support, who will give us an overview of trends in student mental health and talk about how this has impacted student behavior on our campus. We're then going to shift to the career services viewpoint, and we'll hear from Trish Schaefer and Scott Rappaport from the Career Development Center about the obstacles we in career services and you recruiters face as a result of this student behavior. Scott, Trish, and I are also going to offer some advice on recruiting strategies that you might want to consider for next year. And then finally, we'll conclude the session by raising some bold questions. We want you to reflect on these questions and hope that you'll bring them back to your teams for their consideration as well. So let's jump to the polls. Last week, we asked each of you to complete a survey that would allow us to better understand your current recruiting strategies and experience interacting with and communicating with students this year. 62% of the organizations in attendance today responded. And there was also a diverse representation of organizations in these poll results. The organizations were comprised of nonprofits and for-profits from 15 different industries. So let's dive in. The first question we asked was the extent to which you returned to in-person recruiting this year. As you can see from the first graph there, the majority responded at least that you resumed at least some pre-COVID recruiting activity. And then on the second graph, you'll see that the majority noticed a lack of student attendance at in-person and or virtual events at St. Joe's and other campuses. When asked to comment on this, you guys said things like there were less people both virtually and in person, attendance was lower than pre-pandemic levels, for the amount of time you invested, the ROI was disappointing, and where there might have been decent attendance, student engagement was still really low. So jumping to your feedback on student engagement, we asked if you'd noticed a shift in the quality of engagement you have had with students, and most of you replied yes. You said things like students were far more passive, they were slow to respond or at times even ghosted you. There were fewer applications as a result of the lack of responsiveness. And you also noticed students' short attention spans and a shift in professionalism before the pandemic. We then asked you specifically where you have noticed a change in student behavior. The most notable areas of student behavior change in the responses we received were at career fairs and within student communication. As you can see on the bar graph, 75% of students or of respondents said that they noticed a change in student behavior at virtual and in-person career fairs, and almost 50% said that said the same for student communication, which included emails and messages you sent directly to students on Handshake and LinkedIn. So finally, another student behavior change over the past year has been an increase in reneges. We asked if you had experienced higher than usual reneges this year, and most of you responded yes to that. And then we asked whether or not your company has been collecting data regarding Gen Z's behavior and making adjustments to your recruiting strategy based on this. While a number of you have made strides in this area, most of you responded that your company has yet to act on the data. So thank you to those of you who took the time to complete the survey. I hope that the results that we just went over affirmed that your organization isn't alone, and this gave you some context for the content we're about to get into regarding post-pandemic Gen Z behavior. So now I want to introduce our first guest, Marci Berney. Marci is the Director of Student Outreach and Support, and she is also a Student Life Case Manager here at St. Joe's. She has served in this role for over 11 years. As Director of Student Outreach and Support, Marci works with students, families, and campus partners to connect students facing difficult personal, medical, or mental health situations with support resources both on and off campus. Marci also teaches at St. Joe's. She teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on mental health and addiction. So welcome, Marci, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. So before we dive in, I want to remind everybody, if you have questions, you can post them in the chat box. And you'll also have an opportunity to raise your hand once Marci's finished speaking. So I want to begin by discussing the impact of COVID-19 on students' mental health. So Marci, since the start of the pandemic, how have mental health concerns of students changed?
Yeah, I mean, they certainly have changed, probably for all of us in some way. But when it comes to our students, and this is true for St. Joe's, but probably true for students, whether they're in, K-12 or at other universities as well. But we know that there's been sort of that increased sense of isolation that they may have experienced, especially early on, and an overall sense of sort of uncertainty. Maybe it's uncertainty about the future, maybe it's uncertainty about their current situation. Here at St. Joe's, we've looked at some of the data around how students have reported an impact on their mental health. And our counseling center, they have asked their students that are seeking services through CAPS, specifically, what areas of your life have been negatively impacted by COVID-19? And so self-reported data, over 75% of clients have said, yes, COVID-19 has had a direct impact on their mental health. And then around things like motivation or focus, about 66% of student clients reported there was an impact. Their academics in general, about 65%, and then over 50% reported loneliness, isolation, and then a big one, missed experiences, which really comes to whatever their expectation about these years would have been, that really has shifted and they felt a sense of loss. So over half of our student clients are reporting that as well. But the biggest piece is this increase in anxiety that most students are reporting.
Okay, thanks, Marci. And everybody experiences anxiety, right? We all have a little bit of that in our daily lives. How would you say that the anxiety that students are experiencing as a result of the pandemic differs from that normal level?
Yeah, yeah, and you're right that anxiety, at some level can actually maybe be good, or some level of stress. It motivates us, it helps us to prioritize things, it helps us to kind of give us that little kick to get things done. But yeah, there's a difference when that actually becomes problematic. And there's certain signs that we tell students to look out for, but I do think sometimes they're missing them. But that's really when we see that anxiety or stress is impacting kind of your everyday responsibilities. So, this could be academic, this could be in the world of work for sure, but like inability to focus, that feeling of just generally being on edge, or feeling like you really have this uncontrollable sense of worry. So even more than just that kind of running to-do list and those tasks we have in our head, but this sense of worry or this sense of hopelessness that might come. And of course, we see that impacting sleep patterns. We see that impacting appetite, just kind of our basic ways that we care for ourselves and our wellness. When those things start to get impacted, that's when we know that anxiety is really a problem. It's impacting the way that we interact within our relationships. So for our students, whether that's their peer relationships, whether that's how they're interacting with faculty, certainly how they're interacting maybe with family, and with future employers, it can come out in that way as well.
Absolutely. How would you say, I know you touched on this a little bit, but inside the classroom, I know you mentioned focus has been thrown a little bit. Is there anything else that would be anxiety would affect inside the classroom and outside the classroom, maybe when they are, interacting with people professionally?
Yeah. I'm sure that a lot of us on campus have had conversations with faculty members about the difference that they have seen also in the classroom over these past 2 years. And they have seen a difference, but I think that, a lot of ways in which anxiety presents itself, one of the things I always think about is a lack of interaction. And so that can be withdrawing from people, but also from situations or experiences that maybe you normally would. So kind of that withdrawing. Now that can come from a few different reasons within your anxiety. It could be for sort of that concern, that worry, that fear of what the interaction might be from another person. So whether that is, in a classroom setting, how the professor might respond if I say something the wrong way, or if I ask the wrong question, maybe how my peers might think of me. Because we're talking with employers now, I think that can definitely come out in even putting themselves in spaces and situations where there's maybe that fear of, am I being perceived the right way, or that fear of rejection. So I think that confidence gets impacted sometimes by anxiety for sure. I think behaviorally, then this is inside the classroom, outside of the classroom, but it impacts mood. And so even, the feeling that, like I said, kind of, I guess that confidence in interacting with new people, can be more challenging. And then I think, one other thing that comes up for me, definitely academically, and I think we all try to teach our students not to take this into like their professional lives too, but really like an increase in procrastination can come up, an increase in sort of inability to kind of adhere to deadlines or to sort of multitask, where someone just becomes very overwhelmed due to these feelings of anxiety and worry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely relevant, I think, to what we're all experiencing on this side of things with career. And I know you had shared some data with me prior to this session about students feeling overwhelmed. And even before the pandemic, a significant number of Gen Z students reported feeling that way. How might just that feeling of being overwhelmed impact the way that they make decisions on a daily basis?
Yeah. And that I think is a really good question. So yeah, we've seen the data increase from like that feeling overwhelmed, where right now the latest data we have is like about 40% of freshman students say they feel overwhelmed, very overwhelmed by all that's on their plate. That in the 80s, that was less than 20%. So that's a significant increase. But when you think about decision making, like I mentioned before, students maybe are not able to prioritize projects as well as they could. There is that increase in procrastination. The biggest thing I think that happens, and I know that we see this in the classroom too, is students are less likely to ask for help, I think, than maybe they once were, or less likely to kind of admit that they might be feeling overwhelmed by what they have on their plate. And I think about how that might translate if someone's bringing that into the workplace, that I don't know, are they less likely to sort of delegate to other team members where that might be an expectation? So I think anxiety can play out in that way. And I think we've seen it that way too, where students might feel overwhelmed, but their ability to kind of like admit that or ask the people who are in a position to help, there's a little bit more of a hesitancy to do so.
Interesting. Okay. So knowing that they're feeling overwhelmed and anxious, what are some tips you might offer the recruiters that are on the call today as they're approaching students in person in the fall?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I would assume if students are like me, there's always some level of anxiety that comes into like an interview type situation, but because we're talking about when does it become problematic? You know, one of the things that can be really helpful, and I'm sure this is what employers probably try to do anyway, but for an in-person or even a virtual meeting, letting students know what the format is, what they can expect from the interview, the amount of time that they might be dedicating to that, and who they're meeting with, and even who that person is, maybe if it's like sending a brief bio or something in advance. I think when it comes to somebody really who is struggling with true anxiety, understanding expectations and having some structure is really helpful. And so if there's a way to do that, even in these in-person, interviews or other interactions, kind of just making sure that the student knows what to expect, I think could be really helpful and probably mirrors what would happen with a new employee. So that in that way, it would be helpful as well. But I think that structure, the clear list of expectations or understanding of what to expect going into new experience can really help.
Yeah, and I think that covers in person and virtual, like you said.
Yeah.
I think that there's ways employers can do that in both areas, and we'll kind of touch on that a little bit later as well.
Yeah.
But for now, do you have any suggestions for wellness programming that an employer could incorporate maybe into their onboarding process, knowing that they're going to be hiring a lot of these entry-level employees that might be feeling anxious?
Yeah. That is so important. And I think, not to simplify it, but I think that an employer or an organization in general, in an onboarding process, just to let new hires know what the wellness resources are at a company or at an organization. And if there's some sort of statement or something that's included, whether it's something that's in writing or it's, part of an onboarding process in and of itself, but about how the company values well-being for their employees. I think sometimes even just talking about it and having it be an intentional part of an onboarding process can go a really long way. I know that, and a lot of us may have had a similar experience to this where you don't even think about sort of the wellness benefits that you might be afforded through your job until you really need them or a colleague really needs them. So I think making that an intentional part and making it clear and really just like a value statement on well-being can really be helpful. Especially for this generation that I do think in general, despite the challenges that we've seen as a result of COVID-19, I do think wellness is something that is on their mind for sure. I think that stigma is, we've seen it going in a good direction where it's a little bit lower. I think the pandemic kind of threw us for a loop a little bit, but then I think of like, there's a lot of detailed things we can think about, but I think creating options for people. So like in an onboarding or, coming into a new position, are there just sort of like open office hours where someone can ask a question and make sure that they can sort of get some clarity on what expectations are, that they kind of know who to go to. And I think about, something even that we talk about here on campus that probably could be translated into an employment situation is opportunity for that peer-to-peer connection. we have data on our campus, even around like help seeking. And, we've asked students, and sort of an obvious answer, but, if you were having a difficult time, who would be the first person you would go to? And without a doubt, they always say peers versus a professor versus an academic advisor versus a parent, any of that. And so I think even in like in an employment situation, are there opportunities for like a buddy system or a peer mentor system where they have that go-to person? I think that can really help with easing anxiety as well. So any systems that sort of mirror that.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much for your input on that. One final question before we move on to the career services side. Marci, do you foresee student mental health trends changing again now that things are beginning to return to so-called normal?
Yeah, my crystal ball. So, I don't know. Even prior to the pandemic, I think the rates of anxiety had been sort of trending in that upward direction. And so I don't know in that regard that we would see a change in that necessarily anytime soon. I think, unfortunately, we all know there's a lot of things within our world that kind of cause that anxiety and that uncertainty. But I think that one of the things that even I think our students maybe overlook a little bit, this experience throughout the pandemic has fostered some level of increased resiliency in our students, at least in having to kind of meet goals in a different way than they expected, even if it was hard. I think with the part we're at now, our students, many of them probably haven't intentionally thought about that or figured out a way to articulate that. But I think that there's a lot of hope there for this generation having the ability to sort of maybe think on their feet or kind of adapt or pivot quickly if needed, even if it's hard. They've already had the experience of needing to do that, which could serve them well in the future. But in general, around mental health trends changing, I don't know. Hopefully it will, but I think we always see a bit of a lag time in there. So within the next few years, I think it might start to look, it probably will look similar to what it does now. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. So those are all the questions that I had. Todd posed an interesting question in the chat that I'm going to throw to you now, Marci. He said, if students are feeling a sense of loss for missed experiences, why are they not engaged in the experiences we're providing for them? Why aren't our experiences a way for them to help overcome that feeling of loss?
That is a great question. I think that part of it, and not to speak for every student who has gone through this, but part of this with the missed experiences, I think our students think about when they report that experiences sort of the way that they envisioned them to be, maybe during their high school. Some of our freshmen and sophomores like missing out on like, I never had a graduation, or my senior year didn't end the way that I thought it would, all of that. And then certainly in college, it's sort of the same. So those missed experiences, I think some of it is thinking about, it's just not the experience that I envisioned it to be. I think on the other side of that, our students have been slow to bounce back. That's for sure. I think that's what we all have sort of seen. And I don't think we know exactly what that is about right now. Some of it sure is the increase in anxiety, but I think kind of the automatic going back to normal, whatever that is. I think that's met with some like even emotional hesitancy that our students might not fully even understand what that is. Part of it, I think, is I've had all these virtual options and maybe that's been more convenient. And so maybe I am not quick to go to these in-person things. For others, it's the anxiety that we're talking about. I don't know if I feel comfortable to put myself in that situation. So I think it's a variety of things. But yeah, this question that Todd posed is one that I think we have all asked each other. And then right now, at least, scratched our heads or looked like that dog you had up on the previous slide. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a great question. Thanks, Todd. Any other questions for Marci before we move on in the chat, or if anybody wants to ask directly, feel free. If not, we'll just move on.
I have a question, actually.
Sure, go ahead.
It's Mike Chmielewski here. And kind of going back on mental health, I think social media plays a huge part in that. Do you like see maybe a danger? I can't help but notice, whether it's on Instagram or TikTok, you see more and more people just giving career advice. And I don't know who these people are. I don't know what their career background is, but I'll be scrolling on TikTok and I'll be hit with someone who's saying like, you should be doing this, and this and this. And I'm like, well, I don't even know who you are. I don't know what your background is. And I fear for the younger generation who's so like they're just seeing that everywhere, and they're getting a million different groups from people who they don't know personally. And I think personally, I think that's a huge problem. But I would just be curious to hear your take on that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that is such a good point, and I think, and I know that the career development staff will talk more about the experiences of this generation, but you bring up such a good point, especially with TikTok, and there's all this advice and kind of not knowing, are they an expert? Are they not? One thing that I do think, and this is part of its anxiety, part of it's just who this generation is, getting that advice in kind of these small bite-sized pieces is what sticks with them, for better or for worse. So I think you bring up an interesting point that I think that the session will address too. So how do the experts, all of you, kind of pivot to get in front of them before they're kind of seeing this, or using that format? But I do think our students hear these little sound bites of things. Again, back to the peer-to-peer connection, from whether it's a peer or not, but it's on a platform that they're familiar with, and then that's what sticks with them. So I think your statement is very true. It's something we all should be thinking about. Even here on campus, and we talk all the time on ways that we communicate with students. Like, we're so used to sending them emails, well, they don't read emails. So do our departments have a lot of us have gone to Instagram, and that's how we're trying to get stuff out there. And it's hard to try to pivot and try to figure out what's the best way to reach them the way that they need it. But I think continuing to ask ourselves these questions and ask the students and the young people that we work with to make sure that we're kind of meeting their needs, or just meeting them where they're at, is an important thing to do. I don't know if that fully answered your question, but yeah.
And we'll touch on that a little bit more in the career services side too, as Marci said, because yeah, Mike, it's very valid. And we have some advice for you guys to utilize those social media channels. But with the advice coming from others, it depends who it is. Unfortunately, it's like not something that any of us have control over. But I think the more that we can point the students to the resources that are valid and but are still on these channels that they are using, is probably the best way to approach it. Any other questions for Marci before we move on? Thank you so much for your question, Mike. All right, I don't, hold on one second. Nope, that's it. So thank you so much, Marci. We so appreciate you being here and giving your perspective on this important topic. So thank you for joining us, and we'll now shift gears. So we're going to shift to the career services perspective now. I'd like to introduce Trish Schaefer, the Executive Director of the Career Development Center, and Scott Rappaport, an Associate Director of our Career Development Center, both who have extensive experience in career services. Trish has been the Executive Director here for the past 9 years, and in her role, she leads the Career Development Center team in its efforts to collaborate with internal and external partners to bring creative career programming to our students. And Scott joined our team almost 5 years ago as an associate director in our office. He leads our team in its marketing efforts, the collection and management of student data, and he also manages the First Destination Survey for the university. So welcome, Scott and Trish. Thank you for being here. And again, another reminder, just post your questions as they come up and we'll address them at the end of this part of the session. So Trish, we've just heard from Marci about the impact of COVID on the St. Joe's student mental health and how this has impacted student behavior this past year. From your perspective, how has student behavior impacted the work that our Career Center does to connect students with employment opportunities?
Thanks, Danielle. So we've definitely seen a shift in student behavior that definitely has us scratching our heads on a daily basis. And I want to start before I answer this question, I just want to say that we empathize with our students and respect them for this experience that they've had. They have been, we all have, but for students whose brains are not fully developed yet, this is the age where they're still developing. They've been driving through the fog for years, and so we respect them and we have a lot of empathy for them. So this isn't like a Gen Z bashing thing, or they should do this or they should do that. We really are trying to help them navigate something as we're trying to navigate along with them. But we also know that, like generations before them, Gen Z's is going to have an impact. Their impact will be felt in the recruiting world and the work that we do for years to come, as it should. Other generations impacted us, and a lot of good things came from that. So I think before I get to the specific behaviors, I'd like to provide some context for who Gen Z is. And so Gen Z is truly the on-demand generation. That's what we're calling them within our office. It's the mantra that we have here, just to try to figure out how do we deliver services to a group of people who have lived their entire lives on demand. So as an example, listening to music no longer involves turning on the radio. We've got Spotify, we have all kinds of streaming. So there's not turning on the radio and waiting for your song to come up and having the announcer say it's going to be on in 5 more minutes. You want to listen to it? You go grab it. Being hungry no longer means food shopping necessarily. You can go to the supermarket if you want, but why not just log on to Amazon and have your groceries delivered in 2 hours? Or if you want licorice at 2 a.m, DoorDash can do that for you. So I want it, I get it, is basically how that goes. Watching a movie certainly no longer requires going to a theater. You can if you want, but more likely I'm going to log onto whatever device I have in front of me, my computer, my phone, a TV, and I'm going to stream exactly what I want, when I want, pause it, whatever I need to do, but it's totally going to be on my time. Making calls never, you guys all know this, never involves calling somebody. Gen Z does not use the phone. They hate it. They're very vocal about that. Don't leave a message. They don't listen. So this presents obviously a challenge for us, but they just make plans in the moment, just in time for all of their friends to get together. And they definitely have the expectation that that's the way everything works. Seeking info doesn't require going to the library or looking in a book. You simply Google some information and you don't even have to remember it, right? If you need it again, just Google it again, it will be there, and you'll have 15 resources to help you out with that. And then of course, finally, networking does not mean that you have to attend an event. Social media, LinkedIn, lots of different social media platforms have solved that for us. So let's remember, we all benefit from these. I mean, we all obviously have engaged in these activities as well, but we can recall a time when these on-demand resources maybe weren't available. That's not the case for Gen Z. This has always been how it's been for them. So it can help if you just try to remember, like, if they're not having conversations about remember when. This is just how it's always been. We're now helping them reach their next stage of their lives using antiquated processes. Our processes for them are antiquated. They don't operate, Gen Z doesn't operate this way. So we have to constantly be thinking about how do we reach them. So what's the impact? Fewer skills are being honed on a daily basis. Communication skills, planning skills, putting something on your calendar 3 weeks in advance. My God, that might as well be a year. So there's very little planning ahead that's going on with this generation of students. And again, the expectation is that their world will meet their timing. They're not being like obstinate about things. They literally, this is just how it works for them. So this is a big shift for everybody else to come and meet them. So then as we think about, so back to the question that Danielle posed, which is how has student behavior impacted the work and our efforts to connect students to employment opportunities? We've all seen what's on the screen here. Certainly low attendance and late signups to everything, and high no-show rates definitely went up throughout the pandemic. But late signups, this is our language. If something is due at, if the deadline is 11:59 p.m., why? I can go on at 11:58 p.m. and I'm still on time. That's just the way it works. When we were in school and you handed in a paper you handed it in to somebody. Now it's due on Google or uploaded to Canvas by 11:59 p.m. If you get it in by 11:58 p.m., it's on time. So again, there's no, that planning is our language. It's not their language. Default mode has been virtual, and I think that is because obviously because we forced everybody virtual. We all did that, but virtual is in many ways it's easier. There's great things about virtual. It's certainly brought equity to a lot of experiences, and people have been able to. The convenience is certainly great, but when we default to virtual, when in-person is an option, that can present a challenge with recruiting. I want to draw attention to really the two takeaways. The biggest takeaways for us is that nothing about their behavior is predictable anymore. We truly are just not sure. I mean, Marci has said it. I don't know. You walk around, you look around the table with your peers. We're like, I don't know. What they used to do is no longer what they do. So we have to really train our brains to try to think like Gen Z students. And then finally, this just-in-time behavior does not align with processes that include those long lead times. And if you think about all of the processes that we have in the career centers, because we're on an academic calendar, and all of the processes in recruiting, because you're on a budget year or you're trying to plan ahead on our calendar, on our academic calendar, they require long lead times. So we're just not able to right in the moment come together. Students are making game time decisions and commitments because they can, and it's all that they know. So let's talk about a report that we just learned about. It's from Mary Scott from the Scott Resource Group. And really, Danielle, I think you wanted to really know about renegs with students and what's going on there. There seems to be a trend in that. Through this survey, Mary Scott found that almost 80% of students agreed that they were more likely to decline or renege an offer if they didn't have a, quote, genuine connection to the employer, with virtual engagement and recruiting practices likely to present challenges in developing meaningful relationships. I read that out loud. I know you can read it, but there's so much in there that based on everything we've heard today, it's like, well, yeah, but yes, we know that this is true, but it's not happening when we offer it to them, and that the hybrid options are appealing. And this high touch approach is greatly preferred by the students. So I think what we're seeing, this was a question that somebody asked, maybe it was Todd asked, but I personally think that the students are understanding that they need to emerge from this cocoon that they've been living in, but excuse me, their real anxiety that Marci described is making it more challenging for them. Excuse me, I'm sorry about that. So let's talk about just-in-time high-touch strategies. And forgive me, I'm going to put a throat drop in my mouth. So
Trish, we can always jump ahead and come back too.
That's okay. I think I'll be able to get through it. So
Okay.
It's impossible to separate Gen Z and characteristics and behaviors from the impact COVID has had on them. It's you cannot separate them. But let's remember that for many of the students, all of this recruiting stuff is totally new to them. They've not been sitting in classrooms necessarily with students. There hasn't been that sort of peer observation going on. They've been alone in their rooms, alone in their homes, trying to sort of figure all of this out on their own. So that modeling hasn't really occurred, okay? So here's some strategies that we're gonna suggest. So extend offers later in the year using the fall semester to build those relationships that are important to them, okay? Engage in those activities. And I should stop by saying, I think you have to help pull them out and build that trust with them. They're not accustomed to saying, I don't know. They don't like the feeling of not knowing. So they're going to need some more reassurance from you that this is going to be okay. We're going to talk. It's going to be an okay experience, and you'll get through it. I think engaging in these activities by sending alumni to campus to build relationships is going to be key. And I know that you do this, but those young alums is going to, that peer-to-peer that Marci referenced is important. We recommend hosting what we're calling pop-up events. I'll give you an example. We had on our calendars earlier this year, LinkedIn photos. We knew we were doing them, but we didn't actually promote them to students until like a week in advance. We had, relatively speaking, the best response that we've had the entire semester. So when it just popped up as an exciting experience and something they could take advantage of, and the timing that made sense to them, oh, it's in a couple days, great, I think I'll go. That we would encourage you to do the same. You might send intro videos prior to events, so the students are, quote, oriented. I'm going to share a story Scott told me, that his son, who's going to kindergarten next year, had an orientation. And, the parents were like, okay, it's March, it's April. This isn't until September. But the result of it is that his son now feels really excited about what's going to come. And the anxiety isn't really there anymore. So everything I learned in kindergarten might be true here too. Orient these students. They are feeling very anxious about what to expect, and they haven't had somebody show them that way. If it's allowed by your organization, we highly encourage you to return to in-person interviewing. Deploy your young alums to campus for in-person or virtual drop-ins the day before. Sometimes greeters come, and it's just a couple of minutes before. I think the students need the time to actually ask the questions, be in an environment where they're like, oh, I trust this person. I'm not going to ask a stupid question. I'm going to get sort of the real deal. So help them prep for that experience so that their anxiety goes down. And then finally, this is a rough one, but give thought to a radical redesign of your recruiting. We're going to talk about this, but the timing, again, of this long lead time does not match the way students experience life. So I think I got through that, and I'm going to go on mute. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Trish. I'm going to shift gears now and ask Scott a question. So Scott, Gen Z values, or they claim to value, in-person and face-to-face contact, yet this year at least they've been hesitant to participate in our programs. What impact will continued hesitation have on the soft skills that students bring to the workplace, and how will this affect the organizations who are hiring the entry-level candidates?
Yeah, thank you, Danielle. Well, I think soft skills is really where probably a lot of our recruiters and our employers are seeing some of these impacts, because we know that you want the students coming in with the soft skills being where you need them to be. And over the last 2 years with the pandemic, that's really, it has shifted. So you actually might have to teach some of those soft skills, which in the past you haven't had to do. And that's a mindset shift that we think some of our employers, as frustrating as it might be, would really benefit you moving forward. That will take place in your onboarding process, teaching in different ways, certainly teaching shorter, more digestible. Again, it might go against what you want to be doing, but that's how the students who are graduating today really, that's how they want that information coming, and meeting them there is going to be super important. They're coming in, Marci talked about before, with that anxiety. They're also coming in, one thing that she said was that they're not likely to ask for help, and they're probably especially not likely to ask for help at the higher level. So they might be very hesitant, especially at the beginning, to go to a manager, to go to a supervisor when they need that help or when something's not going right. And one idea that we had is that mentoring is going to become even more important, but we don't mean mentoring by somebody who's been through this for a while, somebody who has years of experience. That mentor might be someone that that you brought on board a year ago, that you hired in last year's class, who has been through it and who's in a different place right now, and is really of the same age, the same generation, and the new employee should feel very comfortable going to that person. But making that connection and formalizing the connection would be something that can be really, really helpful. So having that peer-to-peer mentor and setting it up, we think will benefit you greatly.
Thanks, Scott. Let's talk about social media a little bit. So we know Gen Z is on TikTok and YouTube. What are some suggestions you would make to employers who are unsure about how to expand their online presence to reach this generation?
Yeah, and Mike, thank you for asking kind of along these lines earlier. one thing that I want to share a very, very brief story of how I think we all take social media and we use it in different ways today, ways that we've never done before. And the story I'll share is over the weekend, my hot water heater went, and I knew that the pilot light was out. And the first thing that I did was I went onto YouTube and I put in the brand of my hot water heater and how to relight the pilot. And I saw these videos and I watched them. And then I got down to the hot water heater, and there's a huge sticker on it with all of the instructions on how to do so. But immediately my thought was, this is how I learn, right? This is how things are put in front of me today. Even though, that sticker's been there, the hot water heater was 13 years old and is now no longer, but the sticker's been there for 13 years. It's just not the way that I necessarily think first. I think it is a good lesson on we have to think differently. So putting stuff in front of your candidates on social media is really important. And I know Mike, said, well, how do you know what's out there that's really good, what's not good? And that's where I think if you as the company can put some stuff out there that's not just brand related, but is about your hiring practices, is about the things that you want to see students doing, they are going to look you up on social media when they're interested in you for an opportunity. So then they see it coming directly from you. So get on the platforms and explore them. I wasn't on TikTok until we had thought about doing a TikTok for our office. I got on there and I've seen a lot more, but you have to be on them to explore them and then try to engage as much as you can. And I was doing a little bit of searching before this, and I looked up Ian J. Gallo, who I believe is here today. And there was a candidate that put a TikTok post up there about how she reached out to a recruiter as a cold message. It went so well. It was great brand building specifically for hiring. And I think the more that you can do of that, the more that if you see something that has happened naturally online, trying to connect yourself officially to it, those are really going to help you to kind of build things up. So those would be just a few ideas that I have. Danielle, I actually have a question for you, if that's all right. I know that employers, as Trish said before, we encourage employers to come back in person as much as possible, but sometimes that's just not going to be the case. And virtual recruiting might be a company policy. What are some ways that you're seeing virtual recruiting, that employers are doing well and that you think should be done?
Sure. So we all know that Handshake and other platforms have come a long way since the beginning of the pandemic to help you guys with virtual recruiting. And you can take advantage of all those features that they have, but I want to emphasize that it first really starts with the job posting. Students really want to know what your actual opportunities are before attending a virtual or in-person event or chatting with you online. And many times employers are registering for a career fair and there's no job attached to their registration, and the students may be a little unsure about what they're walking into. And I think that goes back to what Marci said about setting expectations and reducing anxiety. The other thing about job postings is that they should have a realistic expiration date. A lot of times people are putting postings out there that last for over a year. We as career services know that you guys are just hiring on a rolling basis, but it just means that there's no sense of urgency for the student to apply. So you can always repost the job. I would suggest putting it up with a shorter time frame just to kind of create that sense of urgency. And another way to do that is with virtual events. Trish mentioned this pop-up event idea that we've had some success with here, and I wanted to share that with you guys. And like she said, it basically just means sending out your message to the students about the event the week of the event, or the week before, if the week of is a little too much for you. And then having them have short time frames. I actually recently attended a Handshake webinar where they interviewed, I think it was like 1,000 students that had recently attended an event on Handshake. And they found that the perfect amount of time for an info session was 45 to 60 minutes. And I would say for our students, it is around 45 minutes. We want you to stick to under an hour, just because the students are busy, and that will really entice them to join. And putting in the title of the event, how long it's going to be, and who they're going to be meeting with, also encourages them to join live. Something like 30 minutes with AFLAC's hiring managers is very enticing. They know who they're going to meet with, and it reduces the anxiety about joining live versus waiting for the session recording. And then going back to the importance of the job posting, informal chats are another way to connect with students online. Handshake just put this feature out this year. Employers can now connect virtual office hours to a job posting. And as Trish mentioned, Gen Z really wants to establish that genuine connection. And that can be difficult when you're just meeting with students virtually. So I think that these chats are a great way for you guys to informally connect with them. And we're going to be doing a lot more marketing around this to our students as well. So hopefully, if you had tried it this year and maybe didn't have as much success, in the fall, the students will really be on board with this. And then finally, something we're going to be offering recruiters in the fall is the option to record an information session and send it to us to be posted on our YouTube channel. Since the start of the pandemic, we've built a pretty robust offering of career content on our YouTube channel. We have a lot of videos from alums, and we'd like to now open this up to you to record content about your company that we can share with interested students. So I'm going to ask Trish now to jump back in and just kind of summarize what we talked about as a result of COVID and the characteristics of this generation. Trish, what would you say are the biggest obstacles in both getting students ready for the workplace and recruiting them into your organization?
Yeah, I think the first one, it's been a theme throughout this, is to break through that anxiety. You are going to need to coax them out and build their trust. And, they're feeling very insecure about how all of this works. So anything you can do to just build that trust, it's going to take a little bit more effort on your part. And you might be thinking they should know this, but like our current freshmen, our current sophomores, or freshmen, their senior year was canceled. They didn't go to high school in their senior year. Then they came to this campus and they were totally alone. They don't even know how it's supposed to work. So bring that empathy and that context to your engagement with them, and it will go a long way. The deficit in their social skills as a result of COVID is quite real. They've been at home, they've been in their rooms. Again, there's been no peer mentoring or observation going on. So you will have to just cut them some slack and help just to set them up for success. Again, that empathy is going to be important. Continue to help them once they're on your team. We've talked about this. The onboarding has to shift. Some of this is going to shift over to you because they won't bring the skills. Your managers are going to expect them to have the skills, and they didn't attend this session, so they don't know all of this great stuff that you know or that you live on a daily basis recruiting them. So whatever you can do to bring these skills and help them build those skills is going to be important. And then perhaps the greatest challenge is, before you even meet them, examine your processes with these long lead times and create processes that align with on-demand thinking. Not easy to do, totally get it, but if you can shift your mindset to match the behavior of the students, there'll be far less of the dog tilting its head, scratching your head, beating your head against the wall. Why aren't they coming? And, so just create opportunities for them. We're going to bend towards you and they'll bend towards us, and hopefully we can meet in the middle, but it is going to take some creative thinking, I think.
Perfect. Thanks, Trish. And I know we're getting to our last 5 minutes here. So the last thing we want to do is just raise some questions. So we presented a lot of content today. We want you to remember that this is just the beginning of this generation. They're going to be in college for the next 10 years. So really thinking seriously about some of these questions that we've raised and will raise before you leave. I think that, there are things that we need to take seriously even though they may be uncomfortable and disruptive. And we're happy to help you in that process. So the first question I want to pose is, how are you going to build genuine relationships and your pipeline with a student population who is experiencing increased anxiety? And I want to give everybody, if we can just jump to that question, a second to reflect on this. If you have any comments, please put them in the chat. And just some things to consider here. How will you do this in person versus virtually? And how will you change the way that you approach students who may be anxious in a one-on-one interaction? And then the next question, how will you adapt your onboarding process to address the soft skills deficit and set Gen Z up for success in the workplace? Will you offer programming that focuses on workplace skills or communication skills? Maybe offer a mentorship program at work? And John, I did see your question in the chat, and we'll address that before we hop off today. And then the last question I want to pose is, what changes do you need to make to your recruiting strategy to account for the just-in-time behavior of this on-demand generation? And here you might want to consider what obstacles you might face within your organization to make significant changes to your recruiting strategy. We know there's no roadmap to answer any of these questions. They're really stemming from the observations we've made over the past couple of years. And like I said, if you want to really consider making some of these changes, we're here to help you develop a recruiting strategy. So please, reach out following this presentation today. There's a couple questions in the chat that I'm going to jump to before we log off. Scott or Trish, Jana wants to know, she's found that setting up mentorships, sometimes it doesn't stick and more organic mentor relationships are more successful. Any advice for creating effective mentorship relationships that are not organic?
I'll just say, trying to encourage them, make it be known. Maybe if you have some budget, right, for the first month, I know this might not be organic, but if you put, somebody who's been there a year and a new hire, and you say, once a week for the first month, we're gonna pay for lunch for you so that you can have it together, right? It allows it to foster and grow. I think employees are going to figure out who do they want to go to and all of that. But the more that you can encourage, I think the better. The other thing would be, maybe don't put the word mentor on it. It could be a peer-to-peer program. It could be a buddy program. I don't know. There's probably a lot of words, more creative than me that you could use for it. But I think that word mentoring does actually feel very, I've got the information and I'm going to give it to you. So I would maybe try to change that up as well.
And I would just add, I agree with all of what Scott said, and just keep in mind this on-demand format that students like. So if there's somebody, I don't know how your organization, somebody on your floor, a go-to person who you can just ask questions of, hey, I just did this in a meeting and I don't know what's going on. What's the culture around here? How do I manage this? Just a person they can go to, a peer they can go to. So it's not, I'm not building a relationship with you. I'm getting answers to things that are just going to keep me in motion. So thinking about that on-demand format is going to be helpful as well.
And one final question, Trish, for the just-in-time recruiting, would you say that's a one-size-fits approach, or have we observed different responses from student groups and demographics around the just-in-time behavior?
So I don't think anything is a one-size-fits-all approach, just because every organization is going to come with different needs, with different resources, people who can do this. What I think it has to be is just a real shift in thinking around, hey, what's the process right now? We budget in the summer for hires that we want to make for May, and we like to know by January how many people are coming, so that we can then go out in the spring and maybe pick up a few people that we might need. Students in September and August are just not thinking about graduation. I mean, that might as well be 10 years away for them. So it's really about compressing your recruiting so that it better matches what you might do in non-college hiring. And that's scary, guys. I get that. That's like, well, how is that any different from regular recruiting? The difference is it's the relationship building that goes on campus. So you might find yourself doing things with our students that don't seemingly relate to your recruiting efforts and getting a hire, but it's that relationship. It's what students are going to post then on TikTok and Instagram. It's what they're going to say to their friends in classes. It's about them knowing who you are and building that trust and relationship that's going to make a difference.
Thanks, Trish.
Yeah.
All right, I know we're 1 minute over, so I just want to thank everybody who's still here for joining. And like I said, we're always open to scheduling a call if anybody wants to discuss anything further, but we really appreciate your time and we hope you have a great day. Thank you.